Hey everyone, welcome to another advanced PvP guide video thing. In this one, I'm going to help you guys improve your gameplay in any group PvP by going over how team compositions work. Now this may seem like something really basic and only for more beginner players, but I guarantee you that the vast majority of people I have met don't fully understand the intricacies of team compositions, and it shows in their gameplay. So this video should help you both as an individual player to play with your teammates better and fulfill your role better, as well as for making team compositions and figuring out what items you and everybody else in your team should be playing with. Before I start talking specifically about team compositions, there's one thing that you really need to understand. In Albion, defensive abilities, so things like heals, cleanses, shields, etc., all those sort of defensive-oriented abilities are very overpowered compared to their counterparts in the offensive department. It is much easier to keep somebody alive than it is to kill somebody. If a DPS, for example, is trying to kill a healer, that healer should be able to just simply out-heal all of that damage's DPS. They shouldn't be able to die to them outside of some more extreme cases. You notice this coming into play big in stuff like 2v2 Hellgates, where the most common compositions across time are one healer and one DPS, with the DPS just running the absolute most amount of damage they can possibly fit into one build, so they have enough to actually kill somebody through the other healer. Obviously, all of this assuming a relatively equal fight, so things like IP and numbers. If you get like way more numbers than people or way higher IP than your opponent, then it sort of starts breaking down, but assuming an equal fight, defensive abilities are very overpowered. So because of this, this defines every single team comp in Albion Online, because every single team comp needs to find a way to synchronize their damage so that they can actually kill people through the defensive abilities, either by avoiding them or overpowering them or whatever it is. In general, people have found three good different ways of doing this, three different team compositions. These team compositions exist along a spectrum, so they sort of like bleed into each other. None of them are particularly set in stone. They can look a lot like each other depending on the situation and the meta, but generally there are three camps of team comps. So on one end of our spectrum, we have what I call the sustained pressure team comps. These team compositions kill people by outlasting them. These team comps are sort of very slow and grindy, and they slowly whittle down at the enemy's defensive abilities. They slowly pile more and more damage on their enemies, stacking debuffs and buffs on themselves until eventually someone dies. Often these team compositions are defined by sort of damage over time, silences, healing debuffs, and purges. And in the vast majority of metas, these team compositions focus on limiting the amount of healing that the enemy healer or healers can output until they can eventually either outdamage the enemy healer or run them out of resources. On the other end of the team composition spectrum, we have the most famous Albion team comp, which is the clump and dump. These compositions are fairly simple. They basically just take all of their offensive potential, all of their offensive abilities, and all drop them at the exact same time on the exact same people. They kill people by simply overwhelming the defensive abilities by dropping everything at once. You can't heal somebody if they're already dead in one hit. Living up to their name, these team compositions are basically defined by the clump and the dump. The clump being offensive tanks, which use abilities like Hand of Justices and Camellands and Air Compresses, basically abilities to group up as many enemies as they possibly can, and then the dump, which is a bunch of AoE DPS with quick bursts of damage in an AoE that follow up on that group of enemies and try to wipe them in that one instant. Last but not least for our team comps, sitting in the middle of the spectrum is our pick-off team comps. These team comps sit in the middle of the spectrum because they share a lot of similar aspects to both the clump and dump and the sustained pressure team comps. Simply put, these team compositions kill people by choosing one target and using everything to kill them. Depending on what the meta looks like, the way that they kill them can be very different, and it can look a lot more like the sustained pressure comps or more like the clump and dump comps. Just in the past year, we've had compositions here where you use something like a glaive to literally throw a person out of position away from their supporting defensives and then kill them where the defensives can't reach them, and team comps that are much more like clump and dump, where instead of clumping them, they just choose one target and then I'll dump on them at the same time. So for these pick-off team compositions, there's no specific items or types of abilities that define them. Rather, they're mostly defined just by the fact that they try to slowly win fights by killing one person at a time and slowly gaining an advantage. Now, because of some fundamental mechanics to Albion Online, these different team comps typically work best at different group sizes. So in history, we've typically seen specific types of comps mostly be dominant at specific group sizes. So as you go along the spectrum from sustained pressure all the way up to clump and dump, the ideal amount of people for that composition raises. So for small scale like 5v5, typically the best comps are the sustained pressure ones. When we get up to sort of around the 10v10, typically it's the pickoff comps. And then as we get to like the 20v20, the ZVZs, it's more of the clump and dump. Now that being said, you don't have to specifically follow this. A lot of it is based on meta, and other things can work. A lot of people just don't even try other things because it's been the way to do things for so long. Typically though, the deviation is going to exist within a space close to itself. So in ZVZ, you're probably not going to get away with a sustained pressure comp, or on the other hand, in 5v5, a clump and dump comp is not going to work super well. Rather, we have seen unique metas where in like, say the 5v5, where a pickoff comp was the meta instead of a sustained pressure, or in a ZVZ like 20v20, where a single target kill comp was more effective than a clump and dump. In 10v10s, we've had basically all of the metas since they're sort of in the middle of group sizes, anything from sustained pressure to more clump and dump. And these team compositions versus group sizes aren't really random, it's mostly based on fundamental Albion mechanics like AoE escalation, focus fire, and healing sickness that define what the sort of best way to play is. Okay, so what's the point about learning about these team compositions and why they exist? What benefit does it actually give you, and how does it help you play better? Well, the entire reason I'm making this video is to hammer home this one single point that everybody who plays team-based PvP in Albion needs to understand. Every single person in a team needs to be directly supporting that team composition's goal. Every role that you assign in a team composition, every item they wear, every cooldown they use, every step they take, every word they speak, every button they press has to be supporting that team composition's goal. Now, what I'm not saying is that every single person has to say, for example, if you are running a clump and dump comp, it does not mean that every single person has to either be a clump or a dump. Obviously, you're going to need stuff like, say, healers to make sure that clumpers can clump and the dumpers can dump without just dying. So not only do you need ways to kill people by following one of these team composition plans, you also need ways to counter the enemy's ways of killing you. These more defensive roles are usually more in the sort of intricacies parts of team compositions and not the defining ones, as team comps, as we mentioned, are mostly defined by the offensive half of the team that's figuring out a way to kill people. The defensive roles are simply reactions to the offensive compositions of your enemies. That brings us to how to actually improve your gameplay with this knowledge. Well, it's really simple. Not easy, but definitely simple. Know your role and focus on fulfilling it. Know the role of every item you're wearing and use it for its express purpose and only for that purpose. Hell, it can be as simple as taking the right items in the first place. If your comp is running on a 30-second cooldown rotation for synchronizing its damage, and you're running a DPS with a 20-second cooldown weapon on your E, don't take an assassin hood. Really, again, it just comes down to every part of your gameplay needs to be focused on your role or your job or your function or whatever you want to call it. Your positioning, for example, like where you're standing in a fight. If you're running a pick-off comp that's going to fling an enemy back into you and your role is to do the DPS to that target that's being focused, you need to be standing behind your front line ready to throw your damage on them in an instant. For communication, you need to tailor it to only the most important things that need to be said for your role. So if you're in a sustained pressure comp, you need to be calling out targets if you're a DPS, like what you're focusing, important cooldowns like resistance potions, your own cooldowns if you're a healer. For every little part of your gameplay, think about what its function or its purpose is in your composition and try to match your gameplay to it as much as possible. And now I know basically all I've said is like really super basic stuff, just like do your job, but what often happens is people sort of get lost in the moment. And so really a lot of it is just about specifically allocating some brain power to thinking about your role or thinking about the role of certain items that you are wearing. During the fight, it's important, but also simply when you're, say, massing up with your team. When you're looking at your items and waiting for everybody to get ready, just take every item individually, every ability that you have, and think, okay, when exactly am I supposed to be using this? Or how am I supposed to be using this? Who am I supposed to be using this on? During the fight too, there's often an ebb and a flow. There's some up times and there's some down times too, where you're just not really doing a whole lot. Whenever there's downtime, specifically allocate some brain power to think about, okay, what am I not doing correctly here? What part of my job am I not doing particularly well, or what part of my build am I not really using, and how am I supposed to fix that? Once you have these sort of basics down and you're not being overwhelmed and swept up in the flow of the fight, you can start improving even further by predicting and thinking ahead. For example, look at the enemy's team composition, their different roles, and look at what tools they have to make your job or your role particularly challenging or difficult. What things did they bring to try to counter you? Once you identify them, you can get a general sense of what's going to happen. How are they going to try to stop you from doing your job the most effectively? This allows you to specifically look out for those things and think about how you can play better around them. You can also start thinking more about the others on your own team, your friendlies, your allies. How can you make their jobs easier? How does, say, your movement around the fight and your positioning affect your allies and your enemies' positioning? Side note, if you want to know that, check out the last advanced PvP tips and tricks video. Taking all of this together though, fundamentally, team PvP is about getting every person on a team to act in synchrony with one another, to each be a body part that works together. The only way to really do this well is to have a very clear understanding of your job or your role and how you should be looking to use your resources to fulfill it. So understand the comp, understand how you're going to try and kill people, understand your role within that comp, and fulfill it to the best of your abilities. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to do the liking and subscribing and all the other stuff you do to YouTube videos, because it's really hard to find good video topics to make on Albion PvP, especially around improving at Albion PvP, as it's both simultaneously really simple and complex at the same time. So please make sure to leave a comment on this video, letting me know what you thought of it. Just give me some feedback. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.